Are we entitled, to the basis of the book of Joshua, to assume that at some date in the middle of the second millennium before the present era, the Earth was interrupted in its regular rotation by a comet? Such a statement has so many implications that it should not be made thoughtlessly. To this I say that, though the implications are great and many, the present research in its entirety is an interlinked sequence of documents and other evidences, all of which in common carry the weight of this and other statements in this book. The problem before us is one of mechanics. Points out the outer layers of the rotating globe, especially near the equator, move at a higher linear velocity than points on the inner layers, but at the same angular velocity. Consequently, if the Earth were suddenly stopped or slowed down in its rotation, the inner layers might come to rest, or the rotational velocity might be slowed, while the outer layers would still tend to go on rotating. This would cause friction between the various liquid or semi-fluid layers, creating heat on the outermost periphery. The solid layers would be torn apart, causing mountains and even continents to fall or rise. As I shall show later, mountains fell and others rose from level ground. The earth with its oceans and continents became heated. The sea boiled in many places and rock liquefied. Volcanoes ignited and forests burned. Would not a sudden stop by the earth, rotating at a little over 1,000 miles an hour at its equator, mean a complete destruction of the world? Since the world survived, there must have been a mechanism to cushion the slowing down of terrestrial rotation. If it really occurred, or another escape for the energy of motion besides transformation into heat, or both, or if rotation persisted undisturbed, the terrestrial axis may have tilted in the presence of a strong magnetic field, so that the sun appeared to lose for hours its diurnal movements. These problems are kept in sight and are faced in the epilogue of this volume. On the other side of the ocean, the book of Joshua, compiled from the more ancient book of Jasher, relates the order of events. Joshua went up from Gilgal all night. In the early morning he fell upon his enemies unawares at Gibeon, and chased them along the way that goes up to Beth Horon. As they fled, great stones were cast from the sky, the same day, in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites. The sun stood still over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Azalon. It had been noted that this description of the position of the luminaries implies that the sun was in the forenoon position. The book of Joshua says that the luminaries stood in the midst of the sky, allowing for the difference in longitude. It must have been early morning or night in the Western Hemisphere. We go to the shelf where stand books with the historical traditions of the Aborigines of Central America. The sailors of Columbus and Cortez, arriving in America, found their literate peoples who had books of their own. Most of these books were burned in the 16th century by the Dominican monks. Very few of the ancient manuscripts survived, and these are preserved in the libraries of Paris, the Vatican, the Prado, and Dresden. They are called codici, and their texts have been studied and partly read. However, among the Indians of the days of the conquest and also of the following century, there were literary men who had access to the knowledge written in pictographic script by their forefathers. In the Mexican annals of Cuauhtitlan, the history of the empire of Culhuacán and Mexico, written in Nahua Indian in the 16th century, it is related that during a cosmic catastrophe that occurred in the remote past, the night did not end for a long time. The biblical narrative describes the sun as remaining in the sky for an additional day, about a whole day. The Midrashim, the books of ancient traditions not embodied in the scriptures, relate that the sun and the moon stood still for 36 itim or 18 hours, and thus from sunrise to sunset the day lasted about 30 hours. In the Mexican annals, it is stated that the world was deprived of light and the sun did not appear for a fourfold night. In a prolonged day or night time could not be measured by the usual means at the disposal of the ancients. Sahagun, the Spanish savant who came to America a generation after Columbus and gathered the traditions of the Aborigines, wrote that at the time of one cosmic catastrophe, the sun rose only a little way over the horizon and remained there without moving. The moon also stood still. I am dealing with the Western Hemisphere first, but the biblical stories were not known to his Aborigines when it was discovered. Also, the tradition preserved by Sahagun bears no trace of having been introduced by the missionaries. In his version, there is nothing to suggest Joshua ben Nun and his war against the Canaanite king, and the position of the sun, only a very little above the eastern horizon, differs from the biblical text, though it does not contradict it. We could follow a path around the earth and inquire into the various days with sun and moon absent of terrain at different points along the zodiac, while the earth underwent a bombardment of stones in a world ablaze. But we must postpone this journey. There was more than one catastrophe when, according to the memory of mankind, the earth refused to pay the chronometer by undisturbed rotation on its axis. First, we must differentiate the single occurrence of cosmic catastrophes, some of which took place before the one described here, some after it, some of which were of greater extent or some of lesser. Chapter 2. 52 years earlier. The pre-Columbian written traditions of Central America tells us that 52 years before the catastrophe that closely resembles that of the time of Joshua, another catastrophe of world dimensions had occurred. It is therefore only natural to go back to the old Israelite traditions as narrated in the scriptures to determine whether they contain evidence of a corresponding catastrophe. The time of the wandering in the desert is given by the scriptures as 40 years. Then, for a number of years before the day of the disturbed movement of the earth, the protracted unexpected conquest of Palestine went on. It is reasonable, therefore, to ask whether a date 52 years before this event would coincide with the time of the Exodus. In the work Ages in Chaos, I describe at some length the catastrophe that visited Egypt and Arabia. In this work, it is explained that the Exodus took place amid a great natural upheaval that terminated the period of Egyptian history known as the Middle Kingdom. There I endeavor to show that contemporary Egyptian documents describe the same disaster accompanied by the plagues of Egypt, and that the traditions of the Arabian Peninsula relate similar occurrence in this land and on the shores of the Red Sea. In that work, I refer also to Beckey's idea that Mount Sinai was a smoking volcano. However, I reveal that the scope of the catastrophe must have exceeded by far the measure of the disturbance which could be caused by one active volcano, and I promise to answer the question of what nature and dimension was this catastrophe or this series of catastrophes accompanied by plague, and to publish an investigation into the nature of great catastrophes of the past. Both works, The Reconstruction of History and The Reconstruction of Natural History, were convinced within the short interval of half a year. The desire to establish a correct historical chronology before fitting the acts of the nature into the periods of human history impelled me to complete Ages in Chaos first. I shall employ some of the historical materials from the first chapter of Ages in Chaos. There I use it for the purpose of synchronizing events in the histories of the countries around the Eastern Mediterranean. Here I shall use it to show that same events took place all around the world and to explain the nature of these events. The Red World. In the middle of second millennium before the present era, as I intend to show, the earth underwent one of the greatest catastrophes in the history. A celestial body that only shortly before had become a member of the solar system. A new comet came very close to the earth. The account of this catastrophe can be reconstructed from evidence supplied by a large number of documents. The comet was on its way from its perihelion and touched the earth first with its gaseous tail. Later in this book, I shall show that it was about this comet that Servius wrote, Non igneo sed sanguino rubore ficia. It was not of flaming but of a bloody redness. One of the first visible signs of this encounter was that reddening of the earth's surface by a fine dust of rusty pigment. In sea, lake and river, this pigment gave a bloody coloring to the water. Because of these particles of ferruginous or other soluble pigment, the world turned red. The manuscript Kusei of the Mayans tells that in the Western Hemisphere, in the days of a great cataclysm when the earth quaked, and the sun's motion was interrupted, the water in the rivers turned to blood. Ipuwer, the Egyptian eyewitness of the catastrophe, wrote his lament on papyrus. The river is blood, and this corresponds with the book of Exodus. All the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. The author of the papyrus also wrote, "Plague is throughout the land, blood is everywhere," and this too corresponds with the book of Exodus. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt. The presence of the hematoid pigment in the rivers caused the death of fish, followed by decomposition and smell, and the rivers stank. Exodus 7:21. And all the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the river. Exodus 7:24. The papyrus relates, "Men shrink from tasting, human beings thirst after water, and there is our water, that is our happiness. What shall we do in respect thereof? All is ruin." The skin of men and of animals was irritated by the dust, which caused boils, sickness, and the death of cattle, a very grievous murrain. Wild animals, frightened by the portents in the sky, came close to the villages and cities. The summit of mountainous Thrace received the name Haemus, and Apollodorus related the tradition of the Thracians that the summit was so named because of the stream of the blood which gushed out of the mountain. When the heavenly battle was fought between Zeus and Typhon, and Typhon was struck by a thunderbolt, it is said that a city in Egypt received the same name for the same reason. The mythology which personified the forces of cosmic drama described the world as colored red. In one Egyptian myth, the bloody hue of the world is ascribed to the blood of Osiris, the mortally wounded planet god. In another myth, it is the blood of Seth or Apopi. In the Babylonian myth, the world was colored red by the blood of the slain Tiamat, the heavenly monster. The Finnish epos of Kalevala describes how in the days of the cosmic upheaval, the world was sprinkled with red milk. The Altai Tartarus tells of a catastrophe when blood turns the whole world red and a world conflagration follows. The Orphic hymns refer to the time when the heavenly vault, mighty Olympus, trembled fearfully, and the earth around stricken fearfully, and the sea was stirred, heaped, troubled with its purple waves. An old subject for debate is, why is the Red Sea so named? If a sea is called black or white, they may be due to the dark coloring of the water or to the brightness of the ice and snow. The Red Sea has a deep blue color, as no better reason was found. A few choral formulations of some red birds on its source were proposed, an explanation of its name. Like all the water in Egypt, the water of the surface of the sea of the passage was of a red tint. It appears that Raphael was not mistaken when, in painting the scene of the passage, he colored the water red. It was, of course, not this mountain or that river or that sea exclusively that was reddened, thus earning the name red or bloody, as distinguished from other mountains and seas, but crowds of men, wherever they were, who witnessed the cosmic upheaval and escaped with their lives, ascribed the name Haemus or red to particular places. The phenomenon of blood raining from the sky had also been observed in limited areas and on a small scale in more recent times. One of these occasions, according to Pliny, was during the consulship of Manius, Achilles, and Gaius Boreas. Babylonians too recorded red dust and rain falling from the sky. Instances of bloody rain have been recorded in the diverse countries. The red dust, soluble in water, falling from the sky in water drops, does not originate in clouds but must come from the volcanic eruptions or from cosmic spaces. The fall of meteorite dust is a phenomenon generally known to take place mainly after the passage of meteorites. This dust is found on the snow of mountains and in polar regions. The hail of stones. Following the red dust, a small dust like ashes of the furnace fell in all the land of Egypt. Exodus 9:8. And then a shower of meteorites flew toward the earth. Our planet entered deeper into the tail of the comet. The dust was a forerunner of the gravel. There fell a very grievous hail, such as has not been in Egypt since its foundation. Exodus 9:18. Stones of Barad. Here translated hail is, as in most places were mentioned in the scriptures, the term for meteorite. We are also informed by Midrashic and Talmudic sources that the stones which fell on Egypt were hot. This fits only meteorites, not a hail or ice. In the scriptures, it is said that these stones fell mingled with fire. Exodus 9:24, the meaning of which I shall discuss in the following section, and that their fall was accompanied by loud noises, kolot, rendered as thunderings, a translation which is only figurative and not literally correct, because the word of thunder is ram, which is not used here. The fall of meteorites is accompanied by crashes or explosion-like noises, and in this case they were so mighty that, according to the scriptural narrative, the people in the places were terrified as much by the din of the falling stones as by the destruction they caused. Exodus 9:28. The red dust had frightened the people, and a warning to keep men and cattle under the shelter had been issued. Gather thy cattle and all that thou hast in the field, for upon every man and beast which shall be found in the field, and shall not be brought home, the hailstones shall come down upon them, and they shall die. Exodus 9:19. And he that regarded not the word of the Lord left his servants and his cattle in the field. Exodus 9:21. Similarly, the Egyptian eyewitnesses, cattle are left to stray, and there is none to gather them together. Each man fetches for himself those that are branded with his name. Falling stones and fire made the frightened cattle flee. Ipuwer also wrote, trees are destroyed, no fruits, no herbs are found. Grain has perished on every side. That has perished which yesterday was seen. The land is left to its weariness like the cutting of flax. In one day fields were turned to wasteland. In the book of Exodus it is written, and the hailstones of Barad smote every herb of the field, they break every tree of the field. The description of such a catastrophe is found in Visuddhimagga, a Buddhist text on the world cycles. When a world cycle is destroyed by the wind, there arises in the beginning a cycle destroying great cloud. There arises a wind to destroy the world cycle, and the first it rises a fine dust. It raises a fine dust, and then coarse dust, and then fine sand, and then coarse sand, and then great stones, up to the boulders as large as mighty trees on the hilltop. The wind, turns the ground upside down, large areas crack and are thrown upwards, and all the mansions on earth are destroyed in the catastrophic events when worlds clash with world. When the world clashes with worlds. The Mexican annals of Cuautitlan describe how a cosmic catastrophe was accompanied by a hail of stones. In the oral tradition of the Indians too, the motif is repeated time and again. In some ancient epoch, the sky rained not water but fire and red hot stones, which is not different from the Hebrew tradition. Naphtha. Crude petroleum is composed of two elements, carbon and hydrogen. The main theories of the origin of petroleum are the inorganic theory. Hydrogen and carbon were brought together in the rock formations of the earth under great heat and pressure. 2. The organic theory. Both the hydrogen and carbon which composed petroleum come from the remains of plant and animal life, in the main from microscopic marine and swamp life. The organic theory implies that the process started after life was already abundant, at least at the bottom of the ocean. The tails of comets are composed mainly of carbon and hydrogen gases. Lacking oxygen, they do not burn in flight, but the inflammable gases passing through an atmosphere containing oxygen will be set on fire. If carbon and hydrogen gases or vapor of a composition of these two elements enter the atmosphere in huge masses, a part of them will burn, binding all the oxygen available at the moment. The rest will escape combustion, but in swift transition will become liquid, falling on the ground. The substance, if liquid, would sink into the pores of the sand and into clefts between the rocks. Falling on water, it will remain floating in if the fire in the air is extinguished before new supplies of oxygen arrive from the other regions. The descent of a sticky fluid which came earthward and blazed with heavy smoke is recalled in the oral and the written traditions of the inhabitants of both hemispheres. Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Mayans, narrates, "It was ruin and destruction. The sea was piled up. It was a great inundation. People were drowned in a sticky substance raining from the sky. The face of the earth grew dark, and the gloomy rain endured days and nights. And then there was a great din of fire above their heads. The entire population of the land was annihilated." Jesus Christ. The manuscript Quiche perpetuated the picture of the population of Mexico perishing in a downpour of bitumen. There descended from the sky a rain of bitumen and of a sticky substance. The earth was obscured, and it rained day and night, and men ran hither and thither, and there and where, if seized by madness, they tried to climb to the roofs, and the houses crashed down. They tried to climb the trees, and the trees cast them far away, and when they tried to escape in caves and caravans, they were suddenly closed. Caves and caverns, not caravans. अब म अलिक एकछिनमा पढ्छु है फेरि.